The SEC is about to be crazy, and there's going to be a really good SEC team with just 2 losses this year, maybe 2, that are left out of the college football playoff. And people are going to be losing their minds. Hello and welcome. It's always college football. Today is Monday, November 18th, and I'm your host, Greg McElroy. We appreciate you being here. For those of you that were with us yesterday for our immediate reactions, we're a little better today. In case you're curious, voice, maybe not all the way back, might be a momentary, voice pop every once in a while here throughout our 10 takeaways show, but you'll understand. I think the content will be pretty good. It's just maybe not the voice is where it needs to be. I probably need to just go get super gravelly and talk like this so you just can't tell the difference. But gonna have a fun show today. Encourage all of you to like, rate, subscribe as always. And we appreciate those of you that are joining us here on the ESPN College Football YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe. We're good to go. Thumbs up button if you like. Leave a comment if you like. Some of them yesterday, by the way, people very concerned about my voice. Really appreciate some of the hilariousness in the comment section yesterday. We had a good time reading them. It made us chuckle for sure. So we appreciate you guys for having a sense of humor and poking some fun at us. We're always good with that. If you're not busting chops, what are we really doing, right? All right, some takeaways from this past weekend. We're going to talk Georgia, talk Tennessee, talk BYU, talk Oregon, talk about some college football conference championship scenarios. We're going to talk about the College Football Playoff Committee rankings, some things that we're already thinking about, and why one analyst in the business is pushing a narrative that is just outwardly ridiculous. We'll just continue to dive in on all the same stuff. Is the Heisman locked up? All that fun and much more here on Always College Football. So let's kick things off with the big game of the weekend. Let's evaluate what we make of the Georgia Bulldogs. All right, takeaway number 1. Georgia isn't dead yet, and maybe their quarterback is back on track. First of all, let's just start with how cool the scene was and the environment around Athens. It was their first game in 5 weeks. They hadn't had a home game in 35 days. Their first 3 home games weren't exactly, massive programs, massive games. Yes, the game against Auburn was a good one, but they just hadn't been home in a while, man. It looked like those Georgia fans were coiled, looked like they were ready to roll. And as a result, I do think they had a bit of an impact on the game. The fireworks in the pregame between quarters, lights going on and off. It's just a really cool scene. So the funny thing is while the scene in the pregame was phenomenal, the first quarter wasn't so great for Georgia. Just 21 total yards of offense, 3rd and long. That's, kind of where things were. It wasn't great. Was not great whatsoever. But here, is what I think is fascinating. For as much criticism as Carson Beck and this offense had experienced, it was pretty amazing to me to see the response in the light of early adversity. I mean, they're down 10-0. Things are not going that well. Carson Beck had thrown 12 interceptions in the last 6 games. But now we're moving forward, and it's like, all right, who cares? Let's just throw haymakers. And I thought the offensive plan was excellent from start to finish. Now, would I like to see the receivers creating maybe a little more separation? Perhaps, yeah. But there were a few things that stood out in this game. One, Carson Beck kind of picked up where he left off at Ole Miss. Now, we're going to look and nitpick the performance against Ole Miss, and people will say, well, Carson Beck didn't play well in that game. I would agree that while he didn't play well, he certainly didn't play poorly against Ole Miss. He was getting harassed. Quarterback always gets all the blame and all the credit. This time, the offensive line, he's getting hit over and over and over again. Had an interception, on an interception where he was tipped the line of scrimmage. They couldn't really run the ball. They had drops. The protection issues were paramount. So I think it's easy to look at Carson Beck and say, well, he was the reason why they scored just 10 points in the road trip to Ole Miss. But I don't think it was. There was some progress made in that game, and it carried over into this game as well. And the offense were going against an excellent defense in Tennessee. to have a touchdown drive of 92 yards, a touchdown drive of 87 yards. A second half performance where they really shut the door was impressive. And then the offensive line, that was my big fear, was how would Georgia's offensive line hold up against a defensive line that has shown the ability to take over the game multiple times? Well, they didn't substitute anybody. It's the first time all year in which they chose their five. They went with their five, and as a result, 0 sacks. They gave up 5 sacks the week before. Tate Ratledge back at right guard. Monroe Freeling starting at left tackle. The left tackle spot had been a huge problem. And with better protection, you now have better opportunities to dial up a game plan that can keep Tennessee off balance with who they want to try to take away. And guess what? Pick your poison. Because if you want to sell out against one wide receiver and say, hey, you know what, Dominic Lovett, we're not going to allow him to have an impact on this game. Fine. We'll just throw it to the other 5 receivers. 5 different guys and tight ends finished with 50-plus yards. The tight ends by themselves accounted for 10 receptions in the game. And it's been a while since we've seen Georgia really utilize a tight end not named Brock Bowers and feature a tight end not named Brock Bowers. Well, Oscar Delp had his opportunities. Jurasik had his. You saw Lawson Lucky at times this year get loose. I think we found out that right now, Georgia, they might not be the Georgia offense of last year with explosiveness and dudes that can take over the game, but they are still, when they get good protection, very capable of methodically carving you up. I think this is the best performance we've seen from Georgia offensively in a while, and I think it's one that can be built on as well. Finally, before we move on to Tennessee, right now, if I told you your life depended on picking a team that will win the national championship, how many of y'all are choosing Georgia? Honestly, honest question. For as much negativity as we've had, I think, in the court of public opinion about Georgia's inconsistent performance, at the end of the day, when you gotta have it, are they the team that you probably want in your corner? Perhaps. I'm not saying they are or they aren't, but I think a lot of you listening right now would say, all right, if I got to pick a national championship winner and my life depends on it, Georgia feels like a pretty decent bet right now, especially considering what we've seen at times from Ohio State and what we've seen at times from the Oregon Ducks and all the other teams that have been super up and down in the Southeastern Conference. Takeaway number 2, Tennessee's defense picked a bad day to have an off night. Now, the first 9 teams that Tennessee played this year, they held to under 20 points. Well, they finally run into a team on Saturday night on the road that could create matchup issues and that could hold up front. Now, Tennessee's defense, I thought if they were going to win the game, Tennessee's defense was probably going to have a field day. I thought that was going to be the route. I thought it'd be super low scoring. I thought Tennessee's defense could keep them in it. I thought Tennessee probably hold Georgia to under 20 points. It wasn't the case. The thing that was most amazing, though, is that this is a defensive line that how many times this year has been the most unblockable group on the field? I mean, a handful of times. And yet, biggest opportunity of the year for Tennessee, a chance to solidify their spot in the college football playoff. They win this past weekend. They're in, no doubt about it. A chance to potentially solidify their spot in the SEC championship game. And the best part of their team, their defensive line, has 0 sacks, only 2 tackles for loss, and only 5 pressures on 40 dropbacks. That's just crazy when you really think about the group we saw the week before blocking for Georgia and the defensive line that was unable to generate any pressure whatsoever. Now, they had given up some rushing yards the last couple of weeks, Tennessee had against Kentucky, against Mississippi State, but against a gifted quarterback that has kind of found his groove again, their defense just wasn't enough. The other thing that I think was interesting is how often the Tennessee's linebackers and safeties got into really difficult spots. Now, we know that Tennessee's got really athletic linebackers. Arian Carter, Jeremiah Thielander, these are really athletic guys. But Georgia had a bunch of misdirection. They had some eye candy, some eye violations were created, and Tennessee's relative inexperience at the second level was problematic. That's why those tight ends kept getting open. That's why those tight ends had a big day, is that the safeties and the linebackers weren't necessarily capable of handling a situation like that. 350 yards through the air given up. While it was a really good start for Tennessee, they just couldn't quite keep things going as the game went along. I look at Nico Iamaleava, and I thought he was pretty decent. If you look at the receivers, I didn't think the receivers played very well. I didn't think the offensive line played very well. And I did not think they featured Dylan Sampson enough. Just 19 carries for 101 yards and a touchdown. In a game of that significance, I would have hoped that Dylan Sampson would get 25 plus carries. In a perfect world, he gets 30 plus carries because he's your best offensive weapon. Instead, just 19, only 100, and only one touchdown. He needs to be featured more in big games like this down the stretch. However, I do think Nico Iamaleava showed some things in the second half that has me feeling pretty confident about what he could become. And if Tennessee gets in, look, it's no guarantee right now, but if Tennessee gets in, they could be a problem with what they have developing at quarterback, the commitment to the run game, and a defense that, while they had an off night the other night, has been really dominant at times this year. Takeaway number 3, I thought Oregon showed a lot of guts on Saturday night. A lot of guts. There have not been many teams this year that have kept this offense in check. There's not been, honestly, if you really look at the defenses that Oregon's faced this year, there's really only one team that had Oregon scrambling just a little bit, and that was Idaho. I mean, other than that, like, Oregon's been able to move the football consistently. Dylan Gabriel, coming into this matchup against Wisconsin, was completing nearly 3/4 of his passes. He has nearly 3,000 yards of offense through the air, has a 22-5 touchdown to interception ratio. This is one of the best offenses in the country. Scoring, passing, total offense, you name it, they can do a lot of different things. And they've been without Tez Johnson in the past. So Tez Johnson still being out, this was the first time where it felt like his absence was noticed, right? They didn't really hit anything downfield. There were a bunch of just really close misses from time to time. And I didn't think Dylan Gabriel had anywhere near his best stuff. He also had a miss where he threw it behind his intended receiver on the goal line. It led to an interception, took points off the board just there. But for the rest of the game, man, when you got to have it, I love having that experienced quarterback under center. They're down 7. It's 13-6. Oregon's got to put a drive together. There's, 13 plays, 81 yards, 6.5 minutes off the clock. And the biggest play of the night, 4th and 9, gotta have it situation. Dylan Gabriel puts the most accurate pass of the night right onto the body of Terrence Ferguson to keep the drive alive. I mean, the window was tight. There were 3, if you look at it, there were 3 Wisconsin defenders in the area. The window was not big. And he actually had to body up the receiver. When I say body up the receiver, you throw it right on his body. Actually, it was almost like kind of like a back shoulder throw because there was a defender in over pursuit in the front side. It could not have been a more perfectly placed throw. And while the offense, when you look back and you say they only finished with 354 yards, that's over 100 yards off their season average. You look at their third down conversion percentages, just 5 of 15. I actually came out of it thinking, man, the fact that they won that game is pretty dang remarkable, and it speaks to the culture that Dan Lanning has created there in the last couple of years. This was not a clinic offensively, but when the offense was down, who rose to the occasion? That was the defensive side. I think it was their best performance of the year. You had some big moments in which they won. The Uiagalelei interception to finish the game was phenomenal. He had a sack, had 5 total tackles, had a tackles for loss. He was all over the place. So I think when you look at it, when the offense was slightly down, the defense elevated, and that's the makings of a phenomenal football team. If I'm Oregon And I know while Oregon fans are probably sitting there like, man, that was kind of a gut-wrenching performance to watch. I get that. That performance was needed. That is going to benefit Oregon long-term. To have a close call on the road at night, hostile environment, nowhere near your best stuff offensively, and still find a way to win, that tells you an awful lot about the makeup of this team. Super encouraged by what I saw this past weekend. On the other side, man, you're kind of feeling for Wisconsin. I mean, this one had to hurt. I mean, they have had how many missed opportunities this year where they lose badly to Alabama, but we're kind of in the game at least a little bit there in the first half. They give up a second half comeback to Penn State. They are now 0-6 under Luke Fickell against ranked teams in the last 2 years, and they haven't beaten a ranked opponent in more than 3. So it's been a while since this team has been in the mix and beaten a team of this caliber, and Wisconsin had it on their racket. They just couldn't get off the field. That 4th and 9 was the backbreaker that Gabriel delivered to Ferguson there at the end of the game. Takeaway number 4. Is Texas's offense going to figure it out? Because it's starting to get to the point now where you're the tiniest bit concerned, and it's easy now a week out from having watched their performance against Florida and thinking, all right, well, after the Florida game, I'm sitting there thinking, all right, Texas's offense is back. Like, they're in a good spot. Quinn Ewers looked more like himself. This group and this wide receiver core, they're now capable of opening things up a little bit more. Like, I thought the Florida game was the start of what would be a really nice run for the Texas offense. It wasn't. It was almost the anomaly performance here in the back half of the year to what has otherwise been an underwhelming offensive output for the better part of the last 4 or 5 games. And while you're going to look at this game and you're going to say, well, they won, tough, hostile environment, take it and run. I agree with that. This game in many ways felt like the Vanderbilt game from a few weeks ago for Texas. Wow, you look at the final margin, but it never really felt like Texas was in position to lose the game. It really didn't, to me at least. I know that a play or two here or there, and Arkansas could have very easily stolen this thing, but it never felt like Texas wasn't in control. I mean, Texas had only 315 yards of total offense. That's their second lowest output of the season. You're going to look at Quinn Ewers' stat line. 20 of 32, 176, a couple of touchdowns. But to be honest with you, man, there were a few missed opportunities in this game. I thought there really wasn't a great passing performance when taking into account how human Arkansas has looked in the back end all season long. I mean, Arkansas came into this game 124th in the country against the pass. And for Quinn Ewers and company to go for just $176 was not what you wanted. The other thing, too, if the passing game isn't going and isn't clicking on all cylinders, where's the run game, right? Well, running for 144 yards is nothing to be ashamed of, but on 33 carries, you'd like to have maybe a little more chunk yardage from the running back spot. They averaged just over 4 yards a carry. So they had to grind it out. There were a lot of tough yards that were earned by these running backs. But, man, I just want to get just a little bit more home run hitting potential from that group as they move forward. Now, you look at where Texas is at. They got a chance to rebound against Kentucky defense that's pretty solid. Now, Kentucky does a lot of things on defense, but the main thing is they stop the run and they don't give up big plays. They don't give up big plays whatsoever. So hopefully Texas's offense will get back on track, but this is not necessarily a get-right recipe against a defense that's top 30 in the country in most statistical categories. Defensively for Texas, you got to feel great about what you saw. 6 sacks, just 231 total yards given up. You hold them to 10 points. You created a couple turnovers. This was a breakout game for a lot of people along this defensive front. I think a lot of us have already had a lot of confidence in what Texas had along the defensive line, but I'm not sure America was aware of just how good and disrupted this group may be. To finish with that many sacks, to create that much pressure, to apply and make sure that Taylon Green's legs were not a factor in the game whatsoever. I mean, y'all, he ran 16 times for 4 yards. Obviously, that's taking into account the sacks, but 16 for -4 yards is pretty dang impressive. And to know, too, that of those 6 sacks, 4.5 came from the defensive line. They were constantly making sure that Taylor Green's life was really uncomfortable back there behind an offensive line that was at best shaky coming into the game. So clinic defensive performance, but Texas's offense is going to need to be able to do a little more down the stretch. And next week against Kentucky, and then finally against Texas A&M, 2 really good defenses, they will have their hands full moving forward. Takeaway number 5. Florida has quietly been one of the most improved teams in the country. Now, they knock off LSU this past weekend. Tigers are now done from the SEC championship game race. But what's most significant about this performance is Florida now gets to 5-5. They need just one win to get to bowl eligibility. And it can come this week, perhaps, against a top 10 Ole Miss team, or it could come against a 1-9 Florida State team. A win in either gets into the postseason, and most people coming into the season thought that was highly unlikely. What I thought was most impressive about this, Florida's a really young team. We know that, right? So after 3 quarters, sitting there 13-all, thinking, man, I don't know. Do you go with the young team in Florida, even though they have the home field behind them? Or do you lean maybe towards the veteran team in LSU that has a veteran quarterback and an offensive line that will hold up here as the stretch run continues? Well, little did we know that offensive line didn't hold up. The veteran quarterback was constantly harassed, and it was actually the freshman quarterback that made the plays necessary to win the game. You're sitting there watching DJ Lagway throughout, and well, you could tell he wasn't 100%. Nowhere near 100%. He's got a hamstring injury from a couple weeks ago. He got hurt against Georgia. Biggest moment of the game. Fourth quarter, early in the fourth quarter, you see how he moves, steps up to avoid the pressure from the LSU defensive end, Braden Swinson. He gets hit from the other side, throws a perfect ball to Elijah Badger that is tackled down around the goal line. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. It sets up the Jacoby Jackson touchdown run to take the lead. Those were the plays that you would anticipate Garrett Nussmeier making, not the true freshman that is at way less than 100%, and Lagway delivers. Guys, if you look at where things are, Lagway delivered the 36-yard throw in midst of pressure that led to the go-ahead score, and then Jaden Baugh breaks off for a 55-yard touchdown run to put the game on ice. All right, you look at just time of possession in this game. LSU had the ball for nearly 42 minutes, but the efficiency and the big play potential of this Florida offense, nearly 8 yards per play, was the big difference in the game. And what's most important about this win for Billy Napier is its validation, and it's a sign of the things to come, because earlier, a couple weeks ago, Florida's athletic department, they come out and they say, hey, Scott Strickland, their AD, says, hey, Billy Napier is going to be our head coach in 2025. Well, this win is validation of making the correct decision. The progress is obvious, and you look at the 2 plays, like I said, that put this thing out of reach. Both those plays were made by members of the 2024 recruiting class. Baugh and Lagway, both true freshmen, both with the game on the line, delivered for their team down the stretch. Now, before Saturday, Billy Napier had lost 9 out of 10 against Florida's 4 primary rivals: LSU, Florida State, Tennessee, and Georgia. He had lost 9 of 10. Well, you look at the record. Yeah, it hasn't been great against ranked opponents. He's just 3-14. But if you look at where things are moving forward, if you look closely at where things are with those rivals, took Tennessee to overtime in Neyland. And I think that game could have very easily flipped on its head had they made a play or 2 down the stretch, maybe go for 2 in regulation there at the end. And they had a lead against Georgia when Lagway got injured and got nothing from their offense down the stretch. So this season could have looked a lot different, but they just continued to grind away. They continued to improve. And now I think they're a live underdog this weekend against Ole Miss. And then surely a heavy favorite against Florida State, a young roster where a vast majority of their production is coming from freshmen and sophomore. They'll get 15 extra practices here in the winter to kind of jumpstart the 2025 season. So very exciting times for Florida coming up. And I think they got a chance to be a real dangerous team in 2025 if their youth can continue to develop. As far as LSU is concerned, a couple weeks ago, they rally against Ole Miss and they win that game, even though they really didn't have much business winning that game. They went out after that game and destroyed Arkansas. And now you're sitting there thinking like, all right, LSU's a top 8 team in the country. Even though they lost to SC earlier in the year, like they're back on track and Brian Kelly has this thing trending in the right direction. Well, they've now lost 3 in a row. That's the longest losing streak in Brian Kelly's 3 seasons as the LSU Tigers head coach. They got crushed by mobile options at quarterback by A&M and Alabama, but against Florida, it was their own inability to block and protect that led to them losing the game. So LSU at a bit of a crossroads, and it's a difficult game coming up this weekend against Vanderbilt, whose quarterback, by the way, much like A&M and Alabama, is extremely mobile. So gotta have it situation this weekend for LSU if they want to salvage anything from what's been a very disappointing season. Takeaway number 6. Is the Heisman Trophy officially wrapped up at this point? Is this Travis Hunter's and everyone else is playing for second? Now, people look at the stat line and 5 catches, 55 yards, had the 1 carry for a touchdown, just 3 tackles, did have the interception on the deflected pass that he secured and then returned for 21 yards. It's a great play, by the way, by Travis Hunter's teammate Colton Hood to disrupt Isaac Wilson, kind of underthrew that deep left corner route to Munir McClain, gets tipped up, and then Travis Hunter secures it. But I think the highlight reel moment from this game came on the 4th down catch to the right-hand side. Double coverage, cornerback, safety, everyone all over and converging on a 4th down play there in the first half. Travis Hunter goes up, secures it, takes a big hit, and is able to hold on to give the Colorado Buffaloes a fresh set of downs inside the 10-yard line. Look, he's been the front runner now for a while. He's just 89 yards shy of 1,000 receiving yards on the season with 2 regular season games left to go. Might even have the Big 12 championship game to add to his arsenal of impressive statistics. But statistically here, according to Vegas, he's now sitting at minus 400 to win the award. Ashton Genty is currently at 2nd. That is pretty amazing, by the way, because I think Genty had a really nice game this past weekend, had 3 touchdowns, 32 carries, $160. He currently has over nearly 1,900 yards and 26 touchdowns on the ground. So Travis Hunter's minus 400. Ashton Genty is plus 400. You look at what else is behind him. Cam Ward is a distant 3rd at plus 1,200, the quarterback of Miami. And then Dylan Gabriel and Curtis Rourke, they round out the top 5 at plus 2,500. Now, should Travis Hunter win the Heisman? I don't have a problem with it whatsoever. The Heisman is supposed to go to the most outstanding player in college football. I think Travis Hunter has certainly checked many boxes when it comes to a really solid candidacy. I also think it's a somewhat underwhelming year for the Heisman Trophy. And it's not taking anything away from Travis Hunter at all. It's just, what else is there anyone else that has really entered into the conversation? Cam Ward, statistically, amazing, right? Has had so many great moments this year, but the last time we saw him was in a losing effort, and he might have a chance here down the stretch to play some high-profile games, but probably not. They play Wake Forest and they play at Syracuse. Is that going to be enough to change people's opinion? If they make the ACC championship game, they'll be playing Saturday night on ABC up against the Big Ten title. Will Heisman voters be watching more Big Ten, or will they be watching the ACC championship game? So Cam Ward, I think, has a chance, but I don't think it's a real one to close that gap. And then Ashton Genty, how many viewers are going to be watching Boise State down the stretch? I always thought that he had to flirt with Barry Sanders' rushing record to potentially win the award. I think he's amazing. I think pound for pound, he's one of the best players in the country, but I don't see that happening. The other two that I think are live at this point, Dylan Gabriel, who, as a result of a somewhat underwhelming performance at Wisconsin, has seen his odds dip just ever so slightly. And then Curtis Rourke at Indiana. Both quarterbacks, if Curtis Rourke goes out this weekend and lights up Ohio State, right now at plus 2,500, it would not surprise me to see those odds skyrocket. But everyone's looking up at Travis Hunter, and understandably so, in some ways by a process of elimination with what the other guys have not been able to do. Takeaway number 7, BYU went from a first-round bye to possibly missing the college football playoff and the Big 12 title game in about 4 plays. In the final sequence of the BYU-Kansas game this past weekend, it kind of shows you how quickly things can change and how difficult college football is on a play-to-play basis. You're sitting there, 2 minutes left in the ball game, 1st and 10 BYU. Kansas's back is against the wall. They're sitting there at the 15-yard line. BYU's down by 4. They had the game right there. I mean, they had it right there in the palm of their hands, and yet they weren't able to get it done. There was a lot of things that BYU did well in this game. They were able to hold Kansas to just 242 yards of offense. They outgained Kansas by 112 yards. They won time of possession. But what they could not do, and it happened time and time again, they could not finish when they got in the red zone. You see earlier in the game, 16-yard catch by the tight end, ball sitting there at the 5-yard line, just under a minute left in the first half and 2 timeouts. Quarterback Jake Retzlaff tries to throw a fade. It's picked off by Mello Dodson, who really made a pretty easy catch, to be honest with you. That was kind of very similar, by the way, to what happened last year when you watch what happened with Retzlaff's interception. He threw a very similar interception against Oklahoma when they were about to take control of the game. They also made another massive mistake when a BYU player gets hit in the helmet with a punt, which gives Kansas the short field, 3-yard drive, touchdown by Devin Neal, and then the final sequence like I discussed. All that had gone wrong for BYU in the first 58 minutes of the game was about to be erased. It didn't matter. They had the ball 1st and 10, 15-yard line, 2 minutes to go, a couple of plays there, and then on 3rd and 6, you get the pitch to Rapati, got nothing, and then on 4th down, you have a false start, which backs you up. So on 4th and 11, the pass to Roberts came up just a few yards short of the 1st down. So if you look at just how things went, man, so disappointing for BYU to sit there and have security inside the top 3, potentially, of the College Football Playoff Committee rankings. Well, not the rankings, but the seedings. They were last week well positioned as the Big 12 champion to be the 3 seed in the College Football Playoff. Now, they're an underdog on the road this upcoming week at Arizona State. So they go from the penthouse, where they could have a first-round bye, to potentially being out of the Big 12 championship altogether in the event in which they lose this weekend to the Sun Devils, where I said, like I told you, they are a legitimate underdog. So, going to be fascinating. Can they regroup? I hope they can, because they've been a great story all season long. But man, they got to be better in critical moments as the field condenses in the red zone. Takeaway number 8. These conference tiebreakers are ridiculously confusing, and therefore they're ridiculous. When they're ridiculous confusing, it makes them ridiculous. There's 2 weeks left in the regular season, and there's only 2 teams that have secured their spot in the conference championship game. Army and Tulane, they're playing in the AAC championship. We'll figure out who gets the home field. Green Wave hosts Memphis on the 28th of November. So we'll find out who's hosting there. And then Army hosts UTSA on Saturday, November 30th. That'll be at noon Eastern. So we only know 2 teams. The other areas are almost impossible to figure out. The ACC is probably the easiest at the moment. SMU is undefeated. They went out. They're in. Clemson and Miami both have 1 loss in the conference. Clemson has completed ACC play. They have the Citadel this week, I believe, and then South Carolina in the final week of the season, neither of which will factor in to whether or not Clemson makes the ACC title game. So if Miami can beat Wake Forest and then go on the road and beat Syracuse, they'll be in. They'll play SMU, assuming SMU wins one of the next 2. Got it? Pretty simple when you take everything else into account. In a case if it's a 3-way tie, it becomes very complex. I'll explain it next week. But I think SMU is a heavy favorite down the stretch. I think they should be in pretty good shape. Let's move next to the Big Ten, where it gets a little bit more interesting. Oregon, full control. They host Washington. They're 8-0 in the conference right now. They host Washington the final week of the season. It's almost a mathematical certainty that they are going to be in. All right. It's pretty simple. If Ohio State loses or Penn State loses, they're in. If they beat Washington, they're in. Like, there's a lot of things that have to happen for Oregon not to be playing in the Big Ten title game. So I think we just operate under the assumption right now that Oregon will be there. Indiana also alive. They clinch a spot with a win this weekend. All right. They beat Ohio State. They're in. Ohio State has 2 losses. Indiana then would have still 0 losses. And then if they lost the last week to Purdue, which, come on, highly unlikely, then is there a chance where they could get in? Where other teams could get in? Sure, but probably not. They win this weekend, they're basically in. If Ohio State wins this weekend, that means that Indiana can actually still get in with 1 loss, but they would need Penn State to lose one of their final 2, and they need Ohio State to lose to Michigan. All right. And then lastly, Penn State, they need to win both games, have Ohio State beat Indiana, and then Ohio State lose to Michigan. So it's basically just watch. If Ohio State wins this weekend, they're likely playing Oregon for the Big Ten championship game. Simple as that, because I don't think Ohio State's losing to Michigan, and I don't think Indiana's losing to Purdue, and I don't think Penn State's going to lose either of their final 2 games of the season. Easy enough. Perfect. The Big 12. Do you realize that there are 9 teams that are still alive with 2 weeks left in the regular season? It's just unbelievable. 9 teams in the Big 12 that are alive. Now, BYU and Colorado, they're both 6-1 in the conference. They have a 1-game lead over Arizona State and Iowa State. So the easiest thing to happen, the least confusing outcome, would be BYU and Colorado win out. They'll meet in Dallas for the Big 12 title game. Okay? That one's simple. BYU clinches a spot with a win this week at Arizona State and a loss by either Iowa State or Colorado. So if Colorado loses to Kansas or if Iowa State loses at Utah, then BYU is in, but they can also win. They also have to win at Arizona State to solidify that formality, right? Colorado, they clinch a playoff spot if they beat Kansas. And if Arizona State loses to BYU, and Iowa State loses to Utah. So probably not going to figure that out just yet. And then finally, Arizona State, if they win their last 2 games to finish 7-2, they're in, basically. It's like a 98% chance. So the Big 12 is so complex and so confusing that I'll try to help you out, but let's just wait till next week because a lot of the chips will fall this weekend with Arizona State in the mix against BYU, with Colorado as a slight favorite against Kansas. We're going to know a lot more next week. All right, we'll fast forward. And then finally, the Southeastern Conference. There are still 6 teams currently alive, which I've found surprising. I did not think that 6 would still be around, but then you start doing it, it makes sense. Basically, Texas and Texas A&M, if they win out, Texas plays Kentucky this week, heavy favorite. A&M plays at Auburn. A&M just a slight favorite, 2.5-point favorite at the moment. But if Texas and Texas A&M both win this week, then Texas and Texas A&M winner is in the SEC championship game. Number 1 seed, pretty simple. They get to wear home jerseys in the SEC title game. So that's exciting. Now, there is a 50% chance, slightly above 50% chance that Texas and Texas A&M winner will play Alabama in the SEC championship game. The most likely scenario is Bama against Texas, if you run all the simulations and stuff like that. The second most likely scenario is Georgia and Texas. Of course, that's assuming Texas beats Texas A&M. If Texas A&M beats Texas, then they're in, and it's pretty simple. Well, as long as they don't lose to Auburn this weekend, which, as anyone that's followed SEC football before, anybody that knows anything about Jordan-Hare in November, that's not a guarantee. Alabama, as of this moment, is the best positioned amongst the 2 lost teams because they've played the hardest conference schedule of the 6 championship game contenders. It's not quite hey, Bama wins out and they're in. It's not quite that. But if they finish 6-2 in the conference, it's highly likely that they'll be in. They're about a 2-touchdown favorite at Oklahoma this weekend, and they're a double-digit favorite at home against Auburn in the Iron Bowl. The other teams, Georgia. The good news is that they have head-to-head wins against Texas and Tennessee. The bad news is they have losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, which could quickly knock them out of the tiebreaker at 6-2. And then for Ole Miss, the best case for them to find a way in is to finish second at 6-2, have chaos pretty much everywhere, and they're tied with Georgia at 6-2, and they have the head-to-head against Georgia. So basically, percentage chances are Texas has like a 90 or a 75% chance to be there. Alabama has around a 70% chance to be there, assuming they win their final 2 games. Georgia has about a 40% chance to be there, and everybody else has pretty slim chance, but possible. So, like I said, super, super confusing. We will do a deeper dive on this next week when things are a little bit more clear, and it's really 1-game seasons that will decide the outcomes and the fates of many of these teams. Takeaway number 9. This will be the most boring coaching carousel in the history of college football. Now, that to me is because of a few different things. One, I think everybody's really worried about what the House settlement's going to look like. How can I possibly justify writing a $20+ million check to my coach not to be there? Like, I am better served going with what I got right now, putting money into the NIL collective, and really making sure the players are compensated as opposed to wasting money on a buyout. The only way you can really justify moving on from a coach right now is it is painfully obvious that the team is going in the wrong direction. And we have seen a number of different schools come out and voice their support for a coach that entered the season maybe a little bit of hot water, but now they're coming through it on the other side, having survived and having made progress in many cases. Now, Dave Aranda is the most recent coach to have been given a vote of confidence. He entered 2024 on the hot seat this year. He was just 9-16 in 2022 and 23. But if you look at where things have gone at midseason, man, they were 2-4. It was not looking good. They had lost 3 games in a row. But since then, they've won 4 in a row, including beating West Virginia and scoring nearly 50 points in the process. Baylor's averaged 46 points a game during their win streak, and they've won 3 of their 4 games by double digits. They are currently in the last 4 weeks number 1 in the FBS in scoring average. Sawyer Robertson, their quarterback, very few players in the Big 12 are playing better than him right now. It's an unbelievable touchdown interception ratio of 5-1. 20-4 is what he's actually at, but 5-1 on the TD to INT ratio, that's outstanding. We've also seen a couple other things solidify. Curt Cignetti, there was a lot of buzz about him maybe being a one and done at Indiana, and that somebody would go and write a big check to bring Curt Cignetti to their school to revitalize their program. Well, no longer the case. Curt Cignetti is off the market, receiving a $72 million extension at Indiana. That puts to rest that any rumors, anything, he's going nowhere. $8 million a year for the next 9 years. Congrats to him. He's earned every dollar. He deserves it. That's for sure. couple places that we will be keeping an eye on. Because I don't know if they'll make a move, but I don't know if their coach should feel super comfortable right now. Neil Brown at West Virginia, Ryan Walters at Purdue. Those are the two that, maybe something could happen. I think it's probably still unlikely. Ryan Walters in year 2. So is it in their best interest at this point to move on? Probably not. And then will there be a potential retirement? Will Mac Brown retire or something like that? I got to be honest with you. I think there is a very real possibility there is not a single Power 5 firing this year. I think that is a real possibility. Now, could one retire? Could one go to the NFL? Yes, those are very real. Those are always real. But I don't see the Power 5 having a lot of movement this year. And honestly, that's probably a good thing. The G5, however, we've seen a lot. All right, Temple just let go of Stan Drayton after 9 wins in 3 years. We've seen just in the last couple of weeks, Brian Bohannon at Kennesaw State, Mike Bloomgren at Rice, Mike Houston at East Carolina, Will Hall at Southern Miss. And then most recently last week, Mike New at Ball State was relieved of his duties as well. So it's going to be interesting. We'll see where it goes. We'll keep you posted if the carousel spins. But I'm telling you, man, it's going to be a slow year. Just anticipating it being kind of boring. But maybe that's a good thing here in college football for programs looking for stability. Takeaway number 10. We always do this. It's our college football playoff rankings look ahead. Some of the big questions we have going into the rankings release tomorrow night. All right. Number 1, will Tennessee fall to the point in which their playoff hopes are potentially in jeopardy? All right. I'm really curious to see what the pecking order is going to be like between Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. They've all beaten each other. They've all won on their home fields. Bama lost to Tennessee in Neyland. Georgia lost to Bama in Bryant-Denny. And Tennessee lost to Georgia down there between the hedges. Now, Georgia has the best losses because they lost against Alabama and Ole Miss. Both currently reside in the top 10. And the committee this year, whether they should or shouldn't, they have acknowledged that who you lost to matters. Bama and Tennessee, they lost to teams that are just barely above 500 in Arkansas and Vandy. Tennessee lost at Arkansas. Bama lost at 6-4 Vandy. So you can almost add Ole Miss to this list, but they have the worst losses of the bunch. They lost to Kentucky at home, and they lost to a now 6-4 LSU that appears to be heading in the wrong direction. Now, right now, there's also, let's throw in the possibility of Texas winning this week at at Kentucky, Texas A&M losing at Auburn, and then Texas A&M beating Texas in a couple weeks. Then there is a real possibility that the SEC has 6 teams that are all 10-2. In the event in which A&M wins this week and then beats Texas, they're 10-2, but they're in the SEC championship game in that scenario. So the SEC is about to be crazy, and there's going to be a really good SEC team with just 2 losses this year, maybe 2 that are left out of the college football playoff. And people are going to be losing their minds. I'm just telling you, I told you this a couple weeks ago, there are not enough spots to go around. We thought 10-2. Yep, you go 10-2, you'll be in. Not anymore, man. Not in this season. So I wonder what they're going to be valuing. One other thing I'm curious about. Notre Dame, they're in good shape to make the playoff. Right? We know that. That's not up for debate. I thought their win this past weekend, a convincing win against Virginia, it only further solidified their standings. I think Virginia's a solid team. I wouldn't say they're great. They're a solid team. They made quick work of them in the first half of that football game, and their offense continues to get better. But I'm most interested in where is Notre Dame and how likely are they to be hosting a college football playoff game in the first round. We know they can't get a first round bye. We know that. So the best they can do is hosting. And we know that teams that are playing in conference championships, even if they lost, they might be ahead of Notre Dame just because they had to play that 13th game. I'm not saying they will be. I'm not saying they should be. I'm just saying they might be. So if you're Notre Dame and you want to host, you need to be up ahead of as many teams as possible going in to the final week of the College Football Playoff Committee rankings. The other thing I'm curious about, how far will BYU fall? BYU last week up to number 6. How far down do they fall? And I think it's likely at this point, but I think it's likely that Boise is ahead of BYU and Colorado, meaning that Boise is really well positioned to get a first round bye. And the Big 12, their champion, would probably get a home playoff game, but they might not even get that. The Big 12 champion could very well have to go on the road in the first round of the college football playoff. So that's something worth noting. And then finally, Indiana. There's been a lot of discussion about Indiana. I, for one, very much. So here's my evaluation of Indiana. I watch Indiana, and I am remarkably impressed with their level of execution on offense and defense. They do a great job. They're really well coached. I think they have a lot better players than people realize. I think they have some perimeter matchups on the outside with their wide receivers that can be a real problem against some teams. But I also acknowledge that this Indiana team has yet to really see a defense that is of championship caliber. And I saw Joel Klatt comparing Indiana's strength of schedule, which currently is 106th, against Georgia's from last year. Georgia on November 18th of 2023 was 77th. So the gap, not that significant, right? 29 spots between Georgia at 77 last year and Indiana currently at 106. But here's what's stupid about that argument is that last year there was a 14 playoff and strength of schedule really didn't factor in anywhere near as much as conference championships did. Because in a 14 playoff, you basically had to win your conference to have a chance to get to the college football playoff. And there were examples in the 10-team history of the 14 playoff in which teams that didn't win their conference got in. But most of the time, the reason why the team that didn't win their conference got in, it's because other conferences screwed it up. Like there was a 2-loss champion in the Big 12 or a 3-loss champion in the Pac-12 or whatever it may be. So I look at where things are right now, and now that we've evolved to the 12-team playoff, we have to acknowledge that strength of schedule is going to factor in more this year. Because last year, Georgia, them being the 77th ranked strength of schedule didn't matter because we all knew that if they beat Bama, they were going to get in. Like the path was clear. Yes, the SEC East wasn't great. Yes, it was down. And yes, Georgia's schedule last year was extremely manageable, but they still had to beat Bama in the SEC championship game. If they do that, they're in. So we're not looking at Georgia and thinking, all right, yeah, that's 77th strength of schedule, and they didn't have to play in the SEC championship. Yeah, like we should put them in. No, not at all. Like you now this year with the 12-team playoff and with more flexibility and with more opportunity to evaluate different data points, we need to focus on team schedule more so this year than we ever have before. Look, I never expected a bipartisan debate with Joel. I'm not going to have it. I understand that. 3 weeks ago, he had Michigan as a college football playoff contender. So I always take his playoff opinions with a slight grain of salt, but I would hope he'd understand the difference in the data points that we need to consider in 2023 versus 2024. Schedules, playoff format, all these other things, like it's a totally different year. So using last year's basis is not applicable to this year's basis. And strength of schedule didn't matter. Like it was going to resolve itself. It was going to completely resolve itself. And Indiana plays a Big Ten schedule, but their Big Ten schedule is not comparable to that of a Big Ten schedule that some of other Big Ten teams have had to play. Sitting at 106, all right, they are just behind Hawaii and just ahead of South Alabama. There is not a single other Power 5 school whose strength of schedule is below 93. So what Indiana's done up to this point is play a G5 schedule, which is fine because Indiana now sitting this week right in front of them is an opportunity to show the world that our strength of schedule doesn't matter. This week, you go out, you play well. I don't care if you win. I don't care if you lose. If you just play close, if you're competitive, nobody, and I mean nobody, will be able to make a strength of schedule argument against Indiana. You go out and win, you're cooking with gas. You control your own destiny. You go out and lose, fine. As long as you look competitive, people will still come out of that game respecting Indiana. But if you lose badly and you get rocked by, say, 3+ touchdowns, then we might need to start deciding, all right, well, is Indiana really that good? Or are they the product of having played a much weaker schedule than some of the other teams in the Big Ten? It's going to be fascinating. Massive game this weekend. We will preview it on Thursday's edition of Always College Football. For all of us here at ACF, we encourage all of you to like, rate, subscribe to the show. Always appreciate how you guys have supported the show, told your friends about the show, and I always appreciate you guys saying, man, hope your voice feels better. I'm going to be fine, guys. Don't sweat it. It's only a voice. We'll be fine. All right, for all of us here at Always College Football, from Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day, and remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.